Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our Musically Speaking concert preview. I'm Emily Marvosh. I'm a member of the Handel and Haydn Society Chorus and your moderator for today's live stream. Today, we are looking ahead to this weekend when we launch into February with Jordan Hall performances of orchestral works by Johann Sebastian Bach. And I'm joined today by three panelists who will add some context to Bach's work and will also be able to answer your questions. And for historical background and to share some of the music with us, I am joined as always by H&H's Christopher Hogwood Historically Informed Performance Fellow, Teresa Neff. Hi, Teresa.
Hi, Emily.
And it's always a pleasure to have musicians with us as well. You may recognize these faces, but let me introduce them. This is Guy Fishman, our principal cellist, and Ian Watson, our principal keyboard. Hi, Guy and Ian.
Hello. I'll say hi for Ian. He's muted.
Hi, Emily.
Hello. We are grateful to all of you for joining us, for all of our viewers as well. I really enjoy these previews, and I hope that you do too. And even though we cannot see your faces, we do want to hear your questions, and you can submit them to us at any time using the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. I'll share those questions a little bit later with our panelists. We will do our best, as always, to get through as many of them as possible. And that Q&A feature is also helpful for you if you have any technical challenges during this live stream. We have a whole team of H&H friends and family who are backstage and happy to assist you with any problems. And I will also mention that this webinar is being recorded to be shared later on the H&H website. Now, Teresa has some great points to make, so I will turn the floor over to her. And audience, please be thinking of your questions as we go along. Over to you, Teresa.
Thanks, Emily. Let me share my screen and we'll take it from there. So this weekend's concert features 3 of the 6 Brandenburg Concertos, numbers 3, 4, and 5, as well as the orchestral suite number 2. And all of these works share a wonderful kind of common denominator in that they feature the alternation of a large ensemble with either a soloist or a small solo group. We expect that with something called a concerto. We might not expect that with the orchestral suite, but that's just a wonderful little surprise that Bach gives to us. What I'd like to do this evening is focus on the Brandenburg Concertos 3 and 5, because it's in those concertos that Bach gives us different roles for our soloists, and sometimes they're the soloist and sometimes they're part of the larger ensemble. He shows us how that works in the score, and I'll share that with you in just a moment. And then we can turn to Ian and Guy and talk about this kind of flipping of roles from the perspective of the performer. What you see on the screen here is the title page to the Brandenburg Concertos that Bach wrote in his own hand, the manuscript copy, to send to Christian Ludwig, the Margrave of Brandenburg, in 1721. And if we turn to Concerto number 3, this is the very end of the first movement, Allegro, which you see in pink here, highlighted in pink. And if I go forward, the second movement is just 2 chords, which brings lots of performance questions with it. And the third movement then is another Allegro. But what I like about this particular page in the manuscript is that it shows us all 3 kind of possibilities, or 3 different possibilities for the performers. Here they are playing and concluding the first movement all together as part of the large ensemble. Here they are in the second movement, sounding 2 chords. Now, what usually happens is that someone, the violinist, maybe the cellist, will then reiterate or improvise over these lines. And that leads us directly into the third movement. And here I blocked out just the beginnings of ideas in orange because you can see how the first violin starts, the second violin answers, then violin 3 plus all the violas come in and give us another answer. And then the cellos come in, 1, 2, 3, with the continuo line. And so we have a imitation or a kind of round that starts. And if you're not playing this main theme line, you can see that you don't have maybe as many notes to play. So it becomes a kind of how much black there is on the page, right? And so the performers are being both the large ensemble as well as the soloist. So we can hear that. And I have a performance of the third concerto by the Handel and Haydn Society from 2018. And we'll start with just this page, that very, very end. So we hear the whole ensemble. And in this performance, we'll hear the first violin, then start an improvisatory line. I'm going to jump ahead just a little bit so that we can pick up those 2 chords that Bach has notated for the second movement and the transition into 3. So those changing roles, I think, are really so very interesting all throughout this third concerto, because we have 3 violins, 3 violas, 3 cellos, plus basso continuo, and either solo group, sometimes solo players, but always changing their roles from one moment to the next. The same thing happens in Concerto number 5, but really that role changing happens for the harpsichord alone. And here's the very, very opening of Concerto number 5, and you'll see the solo flute line is on top, solo violin who joins in with the rest of the violins when they play the opening passage for the whole ensemble. But what I'd like to draw your attention to is what happens in the harpsichord part, these last 2 lines. The harpsichord's left-hand part is notated when the harpsichord is part of the large ensemble. And the right hand is left blank because it was up to the individual player to supply the right harmonies or chords. And these little, well, they look like upside down apostrophes all along here. These are actually 6s. Here's a 7. This is a shorthand notation called figured bass that reminds the harpsichord player which chords need to be supplied at any one point. But if you notice what happens at the very end of this page, the right hand is now filled in. And this is when the harpsichord becomes part of the solo group. And with the flute and the violin, the harpsichord creates a trio sonata kind of texture. And if we listen to the opening of the 5th concerto, we can hear how the harpsichord, it's playing with, full sound from the very beginning, but the figures change as it turns to the solo passage. Here's the opening of Concerto 5. And if we go on just a little bit further into this same movement, you can see how the harpsichord has to change its role more and more quickly. So here at the beginning, both hands are written out. Bach is telling us this is the solo passage, and you notice that nobody in the larger ensemble is playing. And then same thing, the right hand of the harpsichord part is left blank. We are now in the large ensemble part of this passage. And so I'm just going to pick it up right where this page starts, and we can hear how those roles change once again. Now, as we all may know or recall, what happens towards the end of this first movement is something that's really quite special, because the harpsichord seems to take over, and it has a beautiful solo cadenza all by itself. And with that idea in mind, I'd like to invite Ian and Guy to talk with us a little bit about the performer's perspective of all of this, right? Bach shows us in the score how this all kind of works out, and we can hear it, but both of you have to change roles rather quickly in both of these concertos. Ian, if we start with you as our harpsichordist, how do you think about this? Do you change your thought process, or is it all part of a bigger picture for you?
I suppose it's a bigger picture. The harpsichord part, it's mainly, to be honest, it's mainly solo in nature with the figuration. The figured bass sections are relatively short. I mean, the harpsichord has a kind of a solo role pretty much all the time, I would say, in the first movement at least, not quite so much in the third movement. But in the first movement, yes, I would say that's true. Also, it's thought of as being the first keyboard concerto, although there are two other instruments, which really makes it a concerto grosso, I think, doesn't it? Mm-hmm. It's simply that the harpsichord is the dominant instrument of the three. I mean, the violin doesn't do any of the fancy stuff that you might hear in a Vivaldi concerto or something like that. It's pretty straightforward. The focus is on the harpsichord, and that's obviously by design by Bach. Although this the version we're playing is the second version. There's a first version where the cadenza, which in the second version is 67 bars long and rather elaborate, in the first version is only 18 bars long, and during the course of that first movement, Bach actually writes piano over every solo violin entry. And the thinking is that the harpsichord that was being used was maybe a not very powerful instrument, or a single manual rather than a double. But as I say, in the version we're playing, the harpsichord, I feel, is pretty much continuous. So it's not much of an effort to switch from those two roles, the continuo role and the solo role.
And
I would like to add that there is a third version that Ian will not mention, which replaces the harpsichord cadenza with a cello cadenza, but they don't even play that one at H&H. I don't know why.
Yeah, I'll tell you afterwards. Yeah.
Well, I do want to jump in a little bit, Ian, to ask how difficult is it? I mean, we're looking at the score and there's so many notes on the page. What are the challenges for you as a performer?
Well, without wishing to sound kind of glib, I would say for an 18th century performer, it was probably quite challenging. Bach was one of the great keyboard players of his day. Franz Liszt, for example, when he wrote his B minor sonata, he was probably the only person that could play it. Now, any young concert pianist who wants to have a career as a solo pianist has to play the Liszt sonata. So there's that aspect to it, that the sort of technical things that we get up to now are far in advance of Bach's Brandenburg Concerto. But also the other aspect, of course, and probably the more important aspect, is the fact that if you approach any piece of music from the standpoint of a virtuoso, it's difficult. Anything that we play is hard. Playing 3 notes with the right feeling in the right way is hard. So from that point of view, yes, it is. There are a lot of notes. From a subjective point of view, I've played Brandenburg 5 so many times since the age of about 16 and recorded it a number of times. I really have no idea whether it's difficult or not, which is probably a dangerous thing to say. But yeah, whatever difficulties have occurred seem to occur in different places over the years, as it were. So there we are. We'll see what happens this weekend.
Yes, well, I'll have to arrive at Jordan Hall to see how it goes. And Guy, your position as the cellist also sort of moves back and forth between these worlds of ensemble support and soloist and concerto instruments. Can you talk a little bit about that in the context of these pieces?
Yeah, well, in my sort of privileged position as the principal cellist, many works, depending on whom the cellist accompanies, sometimes will have me, even if my section if the entire cello section is there, sometimes will reduce to a single cellist for balance reasons. And broadly speaking, cellists today, especially symphonic cellists, if they are principal cellists, they are accustomed to being called out to play a solo. It's actually one of my least favorite things. It's so nerve-wracking to be going along in a Mahler symphony and then suddenly have this exposed solo with your entire orchestra, 100 people, highly judgmental, very excellent professional musicians listening. It's something we're sort of used to doing today. I suspect that to an 18th century cellist, especially the ones who were living and working around Bach in that part of Germany where we don't know of any great virtuoso cellists. The cello at this time period when Bach was composing was just coming out of its solely accompanimental role in Germany. Of course, Bach's 6 suites are the prime example of Bach pushing the cello into a solo light. And there are many cantatas that have very difficult parts, but to them, the few measures in the 3rd concerto, and really they are just few, which require sort of a heightened virtuosity, and almost none in the 5th. In the 5th, there are places where Bach separates the bass line for the cello and presumably the cello and presumably the double bass. And so there are times where the double bass isn't playing and the cello's sort of more exposed, but really he uses this for a color, and almost always doubling the left hand of the harpsichord. So really a very subtle coloring of the texture. And so these aren't, to an 18th century cellist, those few bars might have been surprising and maybe slightly more challenging. They don't present a huge challenge, and of course we're so fortunate at H&H to do this basically once a year. We get to play several, if not all, of the Brandenburgs, and so with familiarity, as Ian said, different things hurt at different times. But the one thing that's true is that we're becoming more and more familiar with this music, and you sort of mentally prepare for those moments where you suddenly all you hear is yourself. And that's really the biggest shock, that you're suddenly only hearing what's coming out of your instrument, even if it's for a measure or two. So it's sort of a psychological, not so much a technical. It's actually always a psychological, even in Mahler, isn't it? It's a change of perception of your role in that moment.
We've got
Just
some really...
following on. Sorry, excuse me. So just following on from what Guy said about the cello cadenza possibility. In fact, Bach, who wrote 6 cello suites, I mean, he had a very deep affinity and love for the cello as a continual instrument, and a very benevolent attitude towards his cellists, which is probably why he wrote that 67 bar cadenza, so that the principal cello could have a bit of a snooze during while I'm working, and a guy takes full advantage of that.
I tell you, folks, it's harder to sit there and seem interested than it is to play that cadenza. I mean, let's be honest.
Well,
wants to
I
get
have
up and
seen
get a
you
cappuccino.
both. I've seen you both perform at these pieces, and you're very supportive of each other as colleagues and musicians. We have some great questions from the audience. I'm going to switch over to those. One for you, Teresa. As you mentioned, these pieces were sort of written for a royal patron, and this viewer is very astute that a lot of these pieces sometimes are written as flattery when they're given as gifts like that. Do you hear anything in these pieces that might lend itself to that, or was there any history of that?
In the music itself, maybe not necessarily. The dedication is as flowery as it gets. Your humble servant, these insignificant pieces, et cetera, et cetera. Bach had met the Margrave, and we believe played for him about 2 years prior to sending this collection. So they had an acquaintance, if nothing else. And supposedly the Margrave said, "Send me some of your music." And Bach was responding to that with these 6 concertos. The Margrave, we're not entirely sure, really opened them. The manuscript that Bach presented is in such a lovely condition that, it's been questioned whether he even bothered opening the book. Fairly certain that they were not played in Brandenburg. But we do think that they had earlier versions, as Ian and Guy were talking about, back in other positions that Bach held earlier in Weimar and in Köthen. So there were other nobility who may have, in fact, received that kind of nod, right? But it might not have been the Margrave with these pieces.
Great. Another question, at the risk of getting too much in the weeds, I'm going to give this one to Ian. One of our viewers would like to know, what tuning system did Bach use for these pieces? And is that different from the tuning system that you'll be using this weekend?
Well, nobody knows which tuning system Bach used. There are a lot of theories. There's a very interesting one at the top of the well-tempered clavier with some kind of curlicues and shapes, which people have interpreted as a tuning system for those pieces. And there have been various people who have developed tuning systems. Bach himself apparently could tune a harpsichord in 10 minutes from scratch, which is not surprising, I suppose. But these instruments were part of life in those days. It's not something that required special training. It was something which he probably was doing from a child onwards. But I don't believe there's a particular tuning. We tend to use a velocity tuning at H&H, but I prefer something a little more extreme for these, especially with the keys we're using, D and G. But there's nothing specific, no.
Okay. All right, Guy, question for you. You'll be sort of guiding the audience through these concerts from the stage. So you're sort of a host for this concert. How do you think about performing 3 of the Brandenburg concertos as opposed to 6, which you have done in the past?
Well, all of the sets that we have by Bach, excuse the beef, most of which come in sets of 6, right? This is a typical 18th century publishing standard. publishing 6 or 12 concerti grossi by Handel, by Corelli, 6 sonatas and partitas, 6 suites for cello, English suites, French suites, partitas for harpsichord, all 6, and these 6 Brandenburg concertos. Despite the prevalence of the number 6, we don't believe that they were intended to necessarily be performed as a set. It's a wonderful opportunity to sample the enormous range of presentation that Bach gives us, from a first concerto that it's almost orchestral with a number of winds playing, multiple oboes, multiple horns, bassoon, piccolo violin. He's just pulling instruments out of every shelf, to the last concerto that has these antique instruments, violas da gamba, and gives the solos to violas, which are accustomed to playing inner voices, right? Giving a flute a solo line. A flute is a soft instrument, right? The violin, no surprise there. Giving 9 strings equal opportunities to play. So, each one would be sort of a wonder in and of itself. In groups, you are able to compare and just, the same as he calls them in the presentation, in the dedication. They're just pieces to enjoy, and the number, I don't want to sound too cheesy, but it's kind of a blessing to be able to play any of them. And so I never feel like I wish I was doing 3 more. Sure, I wish I was doing 3 more. When we play these, most of us feel like we wish we could do this every week or once a month. Seriously. Every time is different. There's always something new to explore. The quantity is not really... it's always a meaningful experience, regardless of the quantity, and I feel like my colleagues would probably agree, except perhaps the ones who aren't playing. So the trumpet, horns, not playing in this concert, but when they do, they stick around to listen to the rest of the concertos. It's such a pleasure, and he's so incredibly inventive. It just never gets old. So 3 is great. I'm delighted to be playing 3 of them.
And we heard in Teresa's presentation recordings of the Handel and Haydn Society. You both are on these recordings only from a few years ago. Do you listen back to these recordings and try to find something new for the audience? Or is it just, as you say, you're just living in the moment and experiencing a new musical event every time?
I think that has to be made new every time. I never listen. To be honest, I never listen to past recordings for that reason. I just try to make it's very familiar music to us. We know the music very well, and every time we play it, we know it better. That's, as Guy so rightly said, there's always something else, always something new that you discover.
Yeah.
And so do we listen to recordings? Well, I personally don't. I can't speak for Guy, but I think that one has to make it new every time.
And I just want to add to that Bach sent these off. It may have been a hope for a dedication commission or for a job, potentially. He sent this off to a man he barely knew, who ran a court where there were musicians that he had no idea who was going to see these and play these. And this is perhaps one of the reasons why he gave so many options of instrumentation. Whoever you've got, I've got a concerto for them. And if you know how to speak this language, right, which is what Ian and I and our colleagues work so hard to learn, the way Bach spoke music is different than the way we speak it today. So if you find out, then you start realizing that in addition to having so many different instruments, the way he wrote the music, if you pay special attention, he's actually giving you a lot of instructions, if you know what to look for, about how to approach this music. So you change, but the instructions don't. And so when you come back to it year after year, it's sort of a metric to see where your life is, but the music is still there, and you can interpret similar instructions differently and achieve a slightly different result. But it's always trying to figure out, what does he mean? Why did he do this? Why, instead of 4/4 per bar, why did he write 2/4 for music that sounds like it's in 4? Maybe he wanted it to not go too slowly, so that he would be represented as good of a composer as he was to the Margrave. He couldn't be there to direct. he couldn't be there to play the harpsichord solo. So he wrote music in a way, it's difficult, but it's, if you look carefully, there's instructions in it. And I think that most of our interpretational process, every time we approach these, is centered around understanding that and then getting out of the way and letting the music. One of Ian's best directorial pronouncements is, let's get out of the way. Bach did the work. You just need to get out of his way. And you need to so this is what we do, and it always serves to be kind of a fresh and new experience with music that's this good.
Yeah, that's very good, Guy. In fact, you made some excellent points there, which I'm going to use and pretend that I thought of them.
You're welcome.
But in fact, what you're saying about a kind of the roadmap that Bach leads us, that's what any great composer does, isn't it? Bach didn't use the same language of writing in crescendi and this sort of thing. A composer like Benjamin Britten actually said that he put all of those markings into his scores so that people would really have no alternative but to come close to his intentions. And of course we know Beethoven too, who famously wrote out a repeat so that people couldn't say, oh, let's not do the repeat. He actually wrote it out again to make them play it. And so I think that Bach, you're absolutely correct. He also gives us these unmistakable, if you know what to look for, clues of how to play his music in a really truthful and enjoyable way.
And in your presentation, Teresa, you gave us a great glimpse of that because we were able to see the manuscripts and really see Bach's handwriting. And as you say, the more black notes on the page, that's where your ear and your eye take their interest. Did you make a conscious decision to show us Bach's handwriting in the slides?
Oh, absolutely. I think the manuscript is absolutely gorgeous. And there are places where it seems to have been written very quickly. And you could even notice in that third concerto, the last movement, things don't quite line up, but we know that it's supposed to, and it does, at least for our ears. And it's really fascinating to see the process, right? And I totally agree with Guy and Ian that everything is there that we need. And it's an incredible kind of visual experience as well.
That manuscript is available online to everyone.
It is.
I don't know, maybe people can write in if they're interested, or go to imslp.org, look for the Brandenburg Concerto No. 3, you'll see it there. So
the whole manuscript is scanned, yeah.
Yeah.
A quick question about the venue. So this weekend's concerts will be at Jordan Hall, as opposed to Symphony Hall. And Guy, I'm going to start with you. Is there anything about the venue of Jordan Hall that makes this music fit in one way or the other?
Well, it kind of, it's a great question. It suggests a comparison with performances that you might have heard in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, even in a piece like Brandenburg 3, which is so clearly written for 10, actually 11 instruments, right? 9 solo strings and double bass and harpsichord, where you'd suddenly see 60 people on stage doubling those parts. This is not symphonic music. It's very much chamber music. And it could be done to great effect at Symphony Hall, but a hall like Jordan, which is a smaller hall, more intimate, the audience is closer to the performers. We've done Beethoven symphonies where audiences left feeling like they'd been hit over the head because they literally were. There's so much energy coming from the stage. That's the flip side of Jordan Hall. It really is, for Bach, Jordan Hall would have been huge. He would have never seen. Bach performed this music in a coffee house in Leipzig, Zimmermann's coffee house, with just people all around him. It's really the kind of, it really acts as a partner to the chamber music aspect of this music.
Yeah, Ian, what do you think? Jordan Hall, what about the instrument that you're playing?
I don't really have anything to add to that. That's basically it in a nutshell.
All right. Well, I have one more question for all three of you. Today happens to be National Hot Chocolate Day, which is exactly where I will be going as soon as we log off today. But just a quick question for you. What do you think? Mini marshmallows, large marshmallows, no marshmallows? How do you do your hot chocolate? Teresa, I'll start with you.
I have to say, I do mini marshmallows. I like the little froth on top.
All right. Ian, what do you think?
You know, I haven't drunk hot chocolate in decades. It's just not on my radar at all.
This is a Costco-sized bottle of blended Scots whiskey, and this is the only way to have hot chocolate.
All right, you have heard it from the professionals. We look forward to welcoming you all this weekend at Jordan Hall, and the concert will also be streaming via H&H's new video platform called H&H Plays On. You can visit the H&H website to learn more about that. As always, Teresa has some more extensive notes in the program book, including the story of how Bach was arrested, sort of around the time that all of these concertos came to be. So you'll have to get the program book to look at that. And if you missed any of our past concerts, those are also available to you on H&H Plays On. Thank you, Teresa. Thank you, Guy. Thank you, Ian. Thank you to all our viewers for all of your questions. We look forward to seeing you this weekend and for the rest of the season. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.